on, lagging. Okay, okay, I'm good now. Okay. Okay. Hold on. Just fix my time. In 3, 2, 1. When you have these citizen assemblies that get to have a voice or let people have a voice in determining the future of the nation, you have people who feel listened to and people who care more about the issues that surround them. So what am I going to do in this speech? First, I'm going to prove that, or like I'm going to talk about who are these people and if they are capable of being capable in participating in this. And second, what kind of benefits arise from this, and therefore, or what is the good in these assemblies, and therefore it's something that we support. So just a bit of framing before I move on to my substantives. So first, let's talk about who are these citizens. So this is again according to the society. These citizen assemblies are full of graphically selected. So we can assume that this policy will be changed, or will have people that are changed. So it's a fresh group of people with different ideas and different like upbringings and ideas. So we can assume that they have, and we can also assume that they have an understanding of what issues that are in their country insofar as they are the ones affected by the policies. So for example, if a country implements like a no plastic law, like no plastic use law, these citizens would be affected because they have to follow these laws and therefore not use plastic. And even if they don't have like ideas or understanding, they will receive specialist advice. And also it's because they're incentivized to do this because it's a duty that is given by the government. So there is a bit some sort of pressure that is present. So why is it something that we support, or like when there is a good that comes out of it? Because one, citizens will feel more empowered because they feel a higher level of social participation when they are encouraged to cooperate. So they'll therefore care more about laws more, and they want to become more interested in the overall well-being of their community, particularly in policies that shape the future of the country. And we think it's this is very much important in example countries that have or like it's like they're in these situations of example countries that have like fairly liberal political ideas that are on net and the same. This is most impactful in countries that have a lot of polarization. For example, like the Philippines or like the United States of America, insofar as like the values of the government don't always reflect the majority, when in reality a lot of their policies affect those people as whole. So then what happens then when you have like all these different ideas is it's not just policies that are based on idea that the government officials have in this case, but rather like a reflection of the different ideas or like different experiences that people are living. So why do we think, moving on now to my arguments, like why are these people important actors in this world? Therefore, it's something that we support, that we policies. First, why is this true? So first, they are the ones again affected by these government policies, or like they're the ones affected by the different issues that go around. For example, like if there is an environmental issue happening in their nation, they're the ones affected because they'll probably be experiencing the effects of environmentalism. Or like example, if there's a like criminal issue in their country, like there's example mass shooting, they're the ones experiencing it example directly as victims or indirectly as people who see that this is happening and they're aware that this is happening. So they're the ones experiencing the problems that happen in their countries. Example, as a citizen in the street, I am affected by the kind of criminal justice laws that are implemented. So however, the problem is that not all voices get heard, insofar as like the ones that are empowered, the ones who make policies, are more likely the ones um who are more privileged because they're the one, or like their voices are the ones that are most heard because they have the voice or the capability of like deciding because of their government official or their status, that they can decide the laws that will be passed. So this is a problem, for example, minorities, because even if like some people to some extent can speak out or like make it aware, like example on social media, or their feelings about certain issues, a lot of minorities are not able to um like speak out, insofar as like they'll be silenced or they don't feel incentivized to speak out because governments will just do whatever they want. So example, like there are a lot of people who complain about like gun laws or there's a experience of shootings, but governments don't always pass them because they don't see it as a major issue. So this is difficult for minorities affected even if they do complain. So this is a policy because the policies, this is a problem because the policies affect the citizens' whole lives insofar as it can determine how difficult it may be for them to live their lives, or like will they live in fear because a policy that would save them isn't implemented, implemented. So what happens then on our side, or like what happens when you do have these citizens like participate in these assemblies? You get people's ideas and voices. So you have different representations of people who do have different shared experiences of what is happening. So instead of just government officials that have an idea or image of what they think is happening, this happens again because you have randomly selected groups of people that discuss and talk about their different ideas and views. So the power of making these policies is spread. It's not just to a group of people who are most likely more privileged. So you then, because it's randomly selected, it's demographically select or it's randomly selected, there's a chance that you have different like minorities that could have used this chance. And we think like we can assume that this is shared power because like there is people who do oversee and make sure that like um like it's a group of people that have like it's like a lot of people who do have the chance of speaking out. So we think it's an increased citizenship, like people get to participate more in society and our side, then they're more likely to care about these social issues because they'll be presented, or they'll or first when they do participate in these assemblies, they'll see these issues and see understand. Example, they'll hear from other people or their fellow assembly members like what kind of how those issues affect them, or like when they do research about it, they realize how hard it is. Or in second, like they're also more likely to care about this because they understand then when this like when it's something that is that exists in their world, where there are these assemblies where citizens are required, or like they have the chance to participate in these assemblies, then they will have um, the incentives to understand what's going on. So even if, so just to, like an even if, what if these policies don't work? Like if they don't reach an agreement, or like they don't have a policy that like these citizens don't make a policy that actually affects anything or like make something. We think first it's not likely because again, these people will understand there is a problem, or like, and there is a purpose to this, that they understand that they have to make something that is like beneficial. We think it's still something that we support because we still get people to participate, and we think that's still a net good because you let people at least feel listened to, or like have a chance to have like speak out and like be represented. And we so this means like better social participation, so people are more likely to understand the issues, and people will care about laws more. And we still think like it's more likely to get policies because even if it is wrong, the matter of the fact is that they chose this, and decisions are less likely to be monopolized by example rich people, because you have a group of people or rich people or politicians who have been in power for a long time. So you have um more group of people. So in conclusion, we think it's just good because we get more people to participate in laws, and like they'll people are better represented, and they feel like they are um uh participating in something that is good for the general well-being of their nation. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the first negative speaker to begin next category.
Hi, am I audible? Right, cool. Just a disclaimer, I am unable to turn on my camera because my device does not have one. I do apologize. He, him, preferred pronouns. Please give me 10 seconds to set up my equipment. Sorry for the delay. All right, panel, beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, when talking about controversial issues, right, especially if you want the people to voice out their concerns, you first have to look at who these people are, what their demographic makeup is. The extent of the motion is that these people are randomly selected based on their demographic to then be representative, but there's no quite detailed analysis inside affirmative on how this randomized demographic representation is then proportionate to the harms felt by the people on the ground, because we concede to you that certain controversial issues are felt globally, and to the extent of which they want to feel the proportionate harms, they first have to have proportionate voicing based on the harms. Let's say out of the 150 people, I will explain with more detail in my substantive, but to give you a preface, out of the 150 people, if you were to discuss about Islamophobia, how can you guarantee that you have proportionate representation of Muslims in their council to the extent to which they're able to even voice out their concerns, and B, that concern to them manifests itself to become a agreed upon outcome out of that 150 people discussing it, because realize that the 150 people will never reach a complete consensus to the extent to which they need a simple majority to actually carry on with feasible policies to that extent. Right, panel? But moving on, 3 parts of my speech for today: the responses, substantives, and comparatives. Now, response is just one-fold, because the crux of side affirmative based on the first affirm is that she said a lot of minorities cannot speak out sufficiently on mainstream media due to certain issues where, like, they're usually drowned out by the voices of the right-wing propaganda, right? We say they did not explain on how, by their randomized method, as said in the info slide, how it is able to represent these minorities proportionally to the harms that they feel on the ground, panel. Because some policies, let's say African Americans in America, right? There are African Americans that live in ghettos, but there are also African Americans that live in gated communities. So in a sense that it's randomized, what is the chance of the African Americans living in ghettos that are representative of the harms can be proportionately represented in the assembly itself? There's no guarantee provided. That is the burden they have to prove to you today. And first effort already failed. We hope second effort will do their job properly. At least on our side, we're able to some extent be representative on the minorities through several things, because we hold the legislators accountable on the press. I'll explain further in my substantive. And secondly, having social movements that is then boosted by corporations that seek to gain public reputation and public approval. This is the benefit only exclusive side negative, because these big corporations will only back social movements that have legitimate key speakers, i.e. the legislators themselves, because they do not want to simply piggyback on a social trend, might lose out on their investors, which are typically pro-government to begin with. Right, panel? Moving on to substantive 2 hold. First of all, the principle of democracy. What is then 2 prongs of this? First prong is that the scale of representation from the 150 people in the assembly, or maybe 200 based on the mod or based on other models, but generally within the same range, is not enough. In the sense that countries that implement this have a total population average of maybe like 10 million, 20 million, or maybe like 50 million, right? Out of those tens and millions of people, how then is the 150 selected is enough? Because therein, most of the controversial issues discussed, they must be proportionate to those who felt the arms, which is usually literally the minority. So let's assume the systemic selection of the people is somewhat proportionate to the statistic that they have, rather than the proportional of harm. Meaning to say, the voices of the minorities will still be a minority within the 150. What is your guarantee? Let's say out of the 150 people, you manage to get 1 or 2 gay people, right? Maybe 1 or 2 gays, 1 or 2 lesbians, 1 or 2 trans, right? How are you sure that out of these 6 people themselves, they can equally proportionally voice out their opinions without getting drowned out by the rest of the 140 people, let alone it actually becoming an outcome in the policy itself? They will most oftentimes confide within the majority's voice, as they did in the public, because A, they're a minority even in the assembly itself, and B, the assembly's method itself, because side affirm didn't actually give us how the mechanization of the policy itself, we're just going to assume that you actually need a simple majority to have the outcome. Therefore, they fail in the lack of representation. They fail to have an outcome that is then beneficial to those who are actually affected, i.e. the minority. Second prong to the principle of democracy is that they lack accountability. Accountability being the fundamental principle of democracy, because what is the point of having someone in power if you cannot hold them accountable, you cannot follow through with action? The assembly pool is then randomized. The government can just recycle through it and rotate it insofar as the makeup is not towards their favor. This is bad for accountability, which is the founding principle of democracy. There's no point in having representation if you cannot follow through with policies. In the event that people disagree with the assembly's demographic makeup or even their discussed outcomes, right, they have no structural method to hold them accountable. The best they can do is riot, but government can simply rotate the assembly pool again and again and again to downplay the riots, to downplay the blames, to not have these assembly people as their black sheep, right? It gives governments too much power to dismiss the people's approval. It gives them too much power to dissuade the negotiations to another narrative that say that you don't like this assembly of people, we'll just change it, right? The comparative on our side is much better because we leave it to the legislators. Why is it better? Because these legislators are A, held accountable structurally because we elect them, and B, they have a social contract to serve the people, and C, corporations, when we do hold them accountable on a social and public level based on their PR, corporations will back us up because it's a legitimate key speaker speaking on our behalf in the parliament itself, second substantive Dan panel, the people's perception, right? Because these are assembly of people, two prongs to this. Firstly, the people are reactionary to their environment because they are picked from their demographic, right? Normal citizens like you and me can only comprehend the mechanisms of policies that affect our area. That's even assuming we're even initially aware of the policies and it affects towards our day-to-day life. Because most of our focus is just to get through life day by day, right? We're just trying to get through our next paycheck. Insofar as the bulk of the voting community, i.e. adults and above, their experiences are especially deeply cemented based on their communal tolerances, this then infects them. They will advocate for what is beneficial towards their neighborhood. Only the politically literate will even be ambitious enough to actually advocate for the bigger picture. Side affirmatives need to prove to us on how this is more likely on their side. Now, secondly, who are these specialists panel? Assuming that government is the one choosing, right? Affirmative has to prove to us on how these specialists will A, be neutral, B, at least to an extent where they are not as neutral as you like them to be, they're able to provide a neutral analysis on the issues, being that the issues are controversial in the first place, and C, they will also have to stay as apolitical as possible, whilst also addressing the realistic capabilities of the governing parties in their government to then implement the policies to what resources the people of the assembly have to use their perspective to have an outcome that is then able to be implemented in the long run, that is able to be sustained by the governing party in the first place. Second prong to this is the consumption of knowledge of the people. The model for this at present is that these normal citizens are supposed to cram all the given material for 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks at most, right? And can realistically only do so on weekends because they have work-life commitments, they want to balance it out. Obviously, an average Joe would focus on their career more than something that is to be implemented in a few months down the line, assuming he even comprehends that long-term effect, right? The people are only predisposed towards whatever niche that is predominant to their livelihood, i.e. farmers only have applicable knowledge of farming, accountants only have applicable knowledge of accounting. This then results in them being highly unlikely to find those with applicable knowledge on controversial issues, assuming it is then stay neutral in the first place, and assuming it can even reach bipartisanship in a demographic of 150 people that's not representative of those in harm panel. Even in the best case scenario where these people are able to comprehend it to an applicable extent, there's likelihood for them to have context on the governing party's capabilities to put their policy into perspective. Therein, the policies would be too ambitious. The MPs would still implement it just to gain popular vote, but it will fail in the long run. That is unsustained panel. This is especially harmful because the motion itself states that this is what controversial issues. Therein, the outcomes needs to be sustainable. They need to shape the way that nation tackles these issues. Therein, also affecting how the international community views their nation. Therein, also robbing the prime minister of the power to determine the nation's international PR panel. If you want democracy to function properly, please oppose.
I think first negative that speech and welcome second affirmative to continue Af's case.
Hello, am I audible? Hello? Hello?
Yeah. Yes, audible.
Okay, thank you. So according to the opposition, they said that they questioned how can we guarantee that among 150 people, there is enough representation? Well, if we're talking about math here, well, there will still be enough representation. Why? First, we told you that it is most likely that it is randomized, especially per issues. And even if that's true, we told you it's better because it is demographically represented. So when it is a Hispanic community, then there is a very high probability that a Hispanic will be chosen. Then minorities are still better represented at the end of the day. That what happens is that people are overseen but by an official who will educate them, and they will also have ideas coming from different people, so there is better discourse. So even if, like, for example, there is only like a few gay people in the group, they are still incentivized to hear the different issues or experiences of other people, and like allies they have different ideas of what happened, but they still share like the common goal. So we told you that people are more likely to care now because they will be presented with these issues, and this would normalize being participatory because they feel the sense of empowerment, because they feel a higher feeling of social participation. So also on the idea of specialists, it says on the info slide that there is an specialist advice and are overseen to ensure that they remain independent. So I don't get the harm what negative is trying to say. Next is they questioned what if the policy is not enough. Actually, there is no perfect policy, and this is not a policy debate. This debate is more on discussing the benefits and harm, and we have proved to you that this does more good than harm. On our side, at least you get to have more representation compared to your side who would rather stick to legislator. But like what about countries with very bad governments where corruptions, political dynasties exist? Well, even in well-off countries, some form of nepotism exists. So they are able to better manipulate like the policies that will be passed. Next, I will proceed to my arguments. First, on our side, there is better representation. Because in governments, especially in very bad governments, political dynasties, nepotism, among other issues that allow certain people to control the policies and reforms that are being passed exist. In these governments, this is very harmful because the welfare of the people are being deprioritized for the sake of the interests of these selfish and power-hungry politicians. On the other hand, in countries with better government, minorities are not well represented. For example, people of color, people who belong to the LGBTQ plus community, people like Hispanic communities and other minorities. As a result, the welfare of these minorities are being treated as of the lowest importance. Hence, generally, on their side, there is power imbalance, which increases inequality, and it decreases popular accountability and political responsiveness among the citizens, thus producing rising frustration and hardship among citizens, which causes them to not care as much, a harm which has already been discussed by my first speaker. However, on our side, people are provided with the chance to talk on the legal level. Compared to strikes and movements, people here are given an official platform to actually speak up. They get more people to listen to them. And in our side, these people have like somewhat a direct power to actually push forward the legalization of such policies that will address their concerns. So this gives the incentive for them to be motivated to create better policies because there's this somewhat like given power or accountability, which like gives them like the responsibility to actually recognize this. So they feel like more accountability in creating these policies that shape the future of their nation. It makes them think that, oh, I am selected to represent the community. There's also this somewhat like peer pressure that exists. So it makes them like it motivates them to like research or to interview their fellow countrymen to make good use of this power that they have that allows them to improve the situation of their country. So it also gives them opportunities to discuss solutions that are community centric, which is good because not all politicians, not all legislators know what's really happening on the ground. However, these citizens get to really have a first-hand experience of these communal and individual struggles that allow them to have more knowledge of better solutions that actually solves the problem. This is great for women, for example, who have very real issues that are often solved by men who think they fully understand the issue, or the LGBTQ plus community who don't have a lot of avenues to talk about their issues on a national level. But on their side, they get better representation. You get better discourse among different demographics. And it's not a bubble. It's not a bubble of like politicians or legislators. Everybody can do their part in being catalysts of positive and mass-oriented change. And next, on my second argument, on our side, you also get decreased corruption when it comes to dictating policies. So there sometimes in the status quo, there is little pushback between policies, which makes it easier for people on top to control stuff or be bribed in passing laws. So which is very bad because like it creates inequality. However, with citizen assemblies, the likelihoods of corruption get significantly decreased because the selection is again randomly chosen and there is a lot of people and their power is shared. So there is less power imbalance. On our side, citizens' assemblies will allow us to have a decreased corruption because, like there's a lot of people representing these different demographics. And even if these people were to be bribed, there's still checks and balances because these are big groups and they have the same level of power. So there's less likelihoods of, like corruption or nepotism. And when there is little room for corruption, we are then able to better protect the welfare of the people, especially those who are at the grassroots level, especially those who are most vulnerable. On our side, they actually get like the platform to be listened to and actually create mass-oriented change. And that we're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the second affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the second negative to continue this debate.
Hi, just making sure I'm visible and audible.
Yeah, perfect.
Visible and audible. Yeah.
Cool. So, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Beginning with responses. I have two. Firstly, will there be enough representation? Will you have so much of differences? Because panel 150 in even 1 million population is 0.00000015. 5 zeros even before you reach a valuable denominator. Of course, you can argue what affirmative can argue is that participation of people directly, but you need to consider the fact that you cannot achieve majority participation. Each state has 13, 14 districts. Even voting or polling stations in a third world country, Malaysia, is 222. How are you going to choose East people from different orientation, different demography? Because definitely the remaining 77 people from other regions who were not elected will complain, why are they not included in the participation? Even if LGBTQ people feel sense of empowerment for participating in the discussion, but their issue isn't being discussed. Why will they be more interested when the most pressing issue that is affecting them directly is not being discussed, but some other issue like criminal justice, which does not affect them, is being discussed? Second question, can any world mitigate corruption? Affirmative tells us people in top are easily corrupted. It creates inequality, they have nepotism. Even if citizens are not corrupted, eventually passing these policies after debating in parliament. Therefore, if you claim people are corrupt on the top, corruption exists in both worlds because eventually it is the prime minister and ministers on the seat who's going to debate and pass the legislation. Even people in France accuse Macron for only choosing certain policies which he feel was tailored to him. Moving on to my first positive material. Why this policy won't address controversial issue? Panel, when we talk about controversial issues in a country, it is not only general matters like climate change and criminal justice. It also includes counter-narrative issues that depart from mainstream media or taboos, certain group of people or places. This looks like A, legalizing same-sex in countries where it's criminalized. B, legalizing prostitution in certain countries. C, legalizing the use of marijuana. D, making better world in way of places where Muslims are being treated. When the selected demographic people is being so heavily polarized, it is very unlikely for you to find a minority to advocate the issues that they want to advocate. But panel, let's be charitable and say you find that one gay man who wants to legalize same-sex marriage. The majority may still belittle him because they will always condemn that there are bigger issues. Your issues can wait because issues like climate change affects the whole country. Therefore, you know what? We'll put your issue in the whole. The first harm is then you fail to address the controversial issue that is deeply systematic rooted within its minorities. But let's be charitable again and say, let's say all the 150 people within the place feel the discussion of legalizing same-sex marriage is so important, even though it's very unlikely. Since the topic is counter-narrative, and it's also against the currently existing legislation, the specialist speakers are constantly going to try and convince all these 150 citizens on the harms of legalizing same-sex marriages. Why is this likely to happen? Note why is it likely to happen. Note panel that these professional speakers and experts are government elected officials. They receive their salary and wages from the government themselves. Therefore, there's an active incentive for these government elected speakers to defend currently existing narrative, to continuously shit on whatever the minority people want. All these issues then are easily being skewed into making 150 people making decisions, for example, not legalizing LGBTQ. Because imagine for past continuous 3 weeks, You're constantly listening from the lawmakers, from the philosophies, from the economists that legalizing same-sex marriage is not good for the country. Of course, people's perception is going to be skewed towards what they're constantly being fed for the past 3 weeks. What are the exclusive harms the negative tells you? A, now the government can pass legislations and say this is what a heavily polarized population of 150 people actually want for the future of country. Secondly, the second exclusive harm is that the people now cannot hold the government accountable. This is because the rights of minorities are now infringed and the government can conveniently paint and say, we actually represent the people. And this is exactly what the people that we choose from randomly want. The next question is, who will the minorities now hold accountable? Is it the 150 people who drew policies against them after being fed by the specialists or exist? You cannot hold them accountable because when government make policies against the people's need, affirmative one says, you know what, minorities cannot speak up. Now imagine one minority against 149 random people who do not resonate and give the same importance to your problem. What is the comparison in our world and why is it better in negative? Now the minorities can actually gather together, mobilize support, call out government injustice in media and show their dissatisfaction as a large group. This is what reflects the real number of people and who are the victims of government legislation instead of random 150 people who do not understand this minorities problem and do not suffer from daily issues that they face. Why will then government better listen in our world? Note, because politicians have an active incentive to remain in power for the next election. Therefore, they need to pass legislation that are within the people's favor. And addressing minorities issues is what is also going to gain more support from the minority group of people if they want to remain in favor. Therefore, on negative panel, we are able to hold the government accountable for their actions and we're able to vote them on if you're not voting for people. There are two metrics where you can educate us here. First, how accountability is better or negative. Secondly, reflection of true people's need won't be achieved with 150 polarized people, but only when the group of minorities mobilize together and voice out. Three, people's voice on controversial issues are better heard on negative response compared to what first affirmative claims. My second positive then, do random people consent for this involvement in city assemblies? The reason voting and election takes place in a country is because people elect politicians from their areas to address the issues, create a better place. Can you imagine people suffering from poverty, single mothers, men working 2-3 jobs on the weekend, farmer who needs to fertilize his crop, want to spend their weekends for 3 consecutive weeks drafting legislation, policies, which is so heavy to understand for their country, when in the beginning, they actually casted their vote, electing their representative in the state and national assemblies. People with challenging background have very less incentive to solve global issues like climate change or criminal justice because their life quality is already so bad and changing these systems does not directly affect them. Therefore, the likelihood of them putting in real effort is very less. Secondly, if you need the people themselves to draft policies, then there's no role for people being elected to become representative. But panel, let's again be charitable and say these 150 people are heavily incentivized. They really want to make changes for their country and they come up with the best policy for the country. The next question comes in, do the remaining 100 million or 200 million consent to these policies that these 150 billion are passing? As a voter, when you vote your representative or politician, you hear to his manifestos and you vote on the basis that he will pass those legislation in your favor. But now, one random person from your region who God knows what personal biasness he has on Muslims, on LGBTQ people, or misogynistic characteristic that he has, is drafting policies in the name of him representing you. Therefore, panel, on the scale here, these citizen assemblies overthrows what the majority people had earlier voted for in terms of trying to achieve the true basis of democracy. Because note, in a constitution place where there exists maybe 30,000 or 40,000 voters, sometimes the margin of vote is very clear. It could be 30,000 to 10,000 of majority votes. But now the person elected to represent in the policy making is that one person from the minority who voted. Therefore, he will be passing policies or making up with legislation which is against what the majority of people voted within the constitution for place. Therefore, it destroys the whole purpose of policies. A few last responses then. In terms of how people's participation is valid in their world. Affirmative has delusional claim that, you know what, in our world, we allow more people to participate. But let's look at the scale then. In our world, in terms of voting process, when you choose a person, there is the whole community within a constituent area is coming out to elect. Therefore, the likelihood of them wanting manifestos or policies passed in their favor is greater. But in comparison, in their world, there is one random man with God knows what biasness is being elected. Therefore, on the scale of people's participation, it is still much better in status quo because we are the one who was executing what majority of people wanted, never been proud to oppose.
I thank the second negative speaker for that speech and welcome third affirmative to close this debate.
Hi, can I be heard and seen?
Yeah.
Ooh, that is not a background. Sorry, give me 1 sec.
That's okay.
Awesome. So, hi, can I be heard well? I had microphone issues
Yes.
a while ago. Okay, thanks. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. And sorry, 3, 2, go. I think in a world where there is just a lot of differences and there is just a lot of options and just a lot of people who want to make different decisions, inevitably there will always be some type of conflict or clash. In 2019, some choice of voting for Biden or Trump and having those two parties only represent them. And even if they were not people who necessarily represented the way the policies that they wanted to pass, they had to vote and they had to make a decision, even if the things that they wanted in the first place were not representative of those candidates that were running for president, right? So I think a lot of what negative's premises and what a lot of their arguments are contingent on is it's contingent on a perfectly benevolent democracy, which is not what this debate is talking about, which is not where this debate takes place. I think their perfect democracy with perfect checks and balances just does not exist in the real world. I think my first speaker proved to you in the first 3 minutes that this is important for countries with no policy movement at all, with heavy polarization, where there's just no movement. In the Philippines, we have been debating the RH bill for God knows how long. The SOGI bill that protects the LGBTQ and the gender identity has been in discussion for the past 5 years. I was literally in high school and that was still happening. And so that means that we have had zero movement in that because of clashing policies, right? And these types of policies are things that the majority of people want in the Philippines, but cannot get because there have been so many corrupt officials, so many political dynasties, and so many same politicians who represent the same thing over and over again. We need to understand that in these types of democracies, the way these people win and get elected are not by fair votes necessarily, but they're usually won because they have no other options or there's some sort of corruption that puts them in that position, right? And so I think the most important people where this debate takes place, and they talk about these controversial issues. We cannot change that. That is not something that is not our duty to prove that we can change. But if you are in a liberal country and you are passing liberal things, then that's fine. That's something that we also cannot change. We're talking about the middle ground here, where the debate takes place, where people want something or some sort of political change that just does not happen in the first place, right? So I think this debate functions specifically in countries where there's a very obvious difference between the views of the government or some sort of corruption in that type of government. If they're liberal and liberal government, I think there's no net change. But I think then these people are the most vulnerable. So let's talk about their case, right? So first, how we will never get a 100% vote, and that's inherently bad. We think on a side affirmative, that's completely fine. Because if we get no 100% vote, that means that there is discourse happening. That means that there are different views being exchanged to the point that they may disagree and disagree with each other. We aren't here to please everyone. We are trying to find a blanket policy that gets everybody to be okay with it, right? We're here to get some sort of social movement in places there have not been a lot of social movements in the first place. We're here to get social change, which only happens when we talk outside of these same politicians that exist in these types of governments where the debate is taking place in. I think this is good. I think even if a negative tries to posit this idea that rich people and poor people are going to be there and that's going to be bad, that's completely fine because it means there's two drastically different parts of the spectrum that can discuss an issue and come together and talk about that issue and talk about their own harms with that thing, right? So if you're a rich person and you're gay, really fine, because your views in that matter are still valid. But if you're a white suburban mom who's also talking in that issue, we think that's still completely fine. I think even if, for example, the LGBTQ plus minority for stagnant countries, we still get that change. I think if they're all homophobes in that room and there is one gay person, you have a captive audience. That is one less homophobic person or one person who's going to actively listen to that view that they would have never listened to in the first place. If you're a homophobe, you're never going to listen to a gay person. But if you are in that position where you have to talk about these policies, policies you are forced to engage, then it is more likely that they will just like talk to people or at least hear out people that they would have never wanted to interact with in the first place. But then I also think that the infographic specifically says that these are like demographically different people. So from people who are from richer places, who will also be representative here, people from middle class places, people from extremely poor places are probably also going to be like a part of this. It's not going to be like, oh, we're only going to get like a big chunk of like rich people from a certain place, right? This is obviously from like different spaces where there are different varying like types of like social class and stuff like that. But then they say that there's no accountability, right? Which I think is just inherently not true, right? So I think we can fear that there's going to be some sort of policy that like probably puts them in place in the same way when we have like jury duty, there's like different types of like punishments and stuff like that when you like don't associate yourself with it or when like you don't fulfill the things that you need to be fulfilled with, right? So we can fear that there's some sort of policy that will ensure that these people will do their job in the first place. But I think there are even people who probably have like beef with them. Like, the government will beef with them. Like the people on the ground will beef with them. And I also think this just has no mechanism. Like this doesn't really make sense. Like I don't understand like if we have to give them like some sort of like, I don't know, resolution regarding this. But then they only say that only the politically literate people are allowed to be in the government, and only they fully understand the problems of their country would have no issues. There would be nothing to fix because they recognize what the problems are. But because these are such controversial issues that have not been discussed and they have to rely on their views alone, I think it's more likely that these like political literate people are probably not super like fit to talk about these types of things. I think like them saying that we are robbing them of their job is not true because you will still do the job that you were given to in the government. If I'm the prime minister, I'm still going to represent my country. But if it comes to controversial issues and handing that off to like a bunch of people, like a certain group of people, that's completely fine because I'm not being robbed of my opportunity because I had so much time to fix that in the first place. And probably if I really wanted to fix it, then it would have been something I already fixed prior, right? So I think even if they already have checks and balances, I think again this debate is specifically important, specifically nuanced to these types of countries that have little like exchanges in terms of that. But then they also like try to talk about this thing where like corporations are gonna help and like they're gonna want to subscribe to this. I think corporations in this like debate doesn't really matter. Like they're not a big deal. I don't think like the government has the capital to do these types of things. Like corporations being backed up is not necessary. If it's law, it's law. They have to follow it. There's no other like alternative, right? But then they'll talk about how this could potentially mean that it's blame citizens, which I think is false. I think it's not true insofar as more people are inclined to believe the citizens and recognize that probably that like I think the accountability we put on like politicians because we voted them in is inherently different insofar as like obviously these are people who like have a certain standard, right, and have a certain thing to put in. But when we recognize that these are citizens, even if they are citizens, I think it is completely and utterly fine that they will probably, or like it is less likely that they will be inclined to believe that this citizen was inherently bad or like going after them or stuff like that. I think if the government is already corrupt, people already know that, and people are already out to get them. I think the fact that the citizens will be blamed, I think, is unlikely. But even if that were true, I think it would not be like a really big deal in a lot of spaces because we still do the like legislative people, right? So in comparison, like when we compare frames, negative had to defend status quo, which my first speaker framed to you was these types of countries that had difficulty in moving these movements in polarization. On their side, there was zero movement at all. Nothing will happen because it stays the same. In our side, even in the absolute worst case that we don't pass policies, at the very least, we get some sort of discourse, some sort of care from other people because they recognize they might become or they might be put into the system in the first place, right? So I think then that if we want to talk about how like the net harms and the net goods are, I think on our side, we get these people to interact, we get these people to talk, we get the people who would have never wanted to meet each other in the first place, talk about their views and have that exchange in comparison to the status quo where we stay stagnant, where we stay the same, and where these policies never end up passing in the first place. And so if you believe in a world that is fair and just, you have to side with affirmative. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the third affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the third negative speaker to close the substantive portion of this debate.
Hi, just before that, can I have like a minute and a half? Someone's at the door. I need to open the door. Just like a minute.
Pardon? Why are you getting a minute and a half? Oh, no, this is the judge. Yeah, no worries.
It's me. It's not the speaker. I'll be back in a minute and a half. I just need to open the door. Thanks.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think we'll wait for the judge to come back and then we'll begin to neg.
Hi, yep, I'm back. Sorry.
Yep,
All right.
third neck could start. That'd be awesome.
Can I just confirm if I'm visible and it's loud and clear?
Yep.
All right, good. Starting my speech. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. While the idea of a citizen assembly is something both sides can kind of agree upon, would probably come from good intent, it is hard for it to be effective, and because of that, it then becomes an undemocratic system, and this motion should fall. 3 things I'll be doing in my speech. Firstly, few technical flaws from side affirmative. Secondly, a comparative on significant issues in today's debate, proving why side negative takes the debate. And thirdly, a summary of negatives case. Firstly, technical flaws from side affirmative. First technical flaw. Government has a burden to prove that it is effective to a certain extent. Panel, I don't think we can let affirmative team get away with saying that all policies have issues and flaws, right? They can't get away with saying that, oh, eventually, even if the policies aren't really as effective or aren't really as useful, all policies have flaws and issues. Therefore, it's still something that's good because participation exists. They have a burden to at least prove to a certain extent how these policies will be effective or how these policies will eventually be used towards a beneficial interest, even if it's not going to be effective towards the extent that they wanted to argue to, and they have failed to do that. Secondly, affirmative logic is basically this, and this is their whole case panel. Their case is more equals better, but never once did they prove this, right? Affirmative never said that how more equals to better. They never proved how when there's more participation of individuals, they never proved how when there's more chefs in the kitchen, it's probably going to become a better recipe, or it's probably going to create a better policy, right? These are all things that affirmative team just simply neglected and dismissed, right? Affirmative's only response towards this is they said, first of all, even if it is not effective, it's very unlikely that it's not going to be effective, which is not even a good even if to begin with. So we don't really understand what affirmative team is trying to prove on. Thirdly, affirmative at least have a burden to tell us to a certain extent how their model will work. And we think this is largely why the debate became a lot more messier and a lot more unclear, right? They didn't really tell us how these lectures on these controversial issues will be done, right? How will you ensure that these lectures are not biased? When will you do these lectures? When will these things happen, right? How would the citizen assembly at least work to a certain extent? We're not expecting you to give like a perfect characterization or a perfect example, especially in every nuance, but at least give us a general idea on how these individuals will be selected, how these individuals will be randomized, what is the period they'll be in the citizen assembly, and all of these kinds of stuff, which they failed to do. Fourthly, they said initially in their first speech, this is about countries, about basically Western countries, right? A lot of their examples were based and related on Western countries. Suddenly, third affirmative speaker came up to us and mechanized their whole model and changed it entirely and said this is only about countries where there is no policy movements at all. I didn't hear any of this coming from first and second affirmative, but even then, I'll still engage with them and telling them why even in these countries, it's still not a good idea. Moving on towards my first issue, in which world does policy making become better? First thing, people are the ones experiencing these problems. This affirmative's biggest push, right? Hence, they should probably be involved in all these things. And this is why basically affirmative wants individuals to be involved, because they directly engage within these problems. What kind of problems? I don't really know, but basically problems. But even in our side, understand that they're involved towards a certain extent. 2 layers towards this. Firstly, understand that we already elect representatives, whether this is the government itself, whether it's the prime minister or some state representatives or city representatives or whatever it is, we have representatives on our side. And who elect these representatives? Obviously us. We elect representatives to do what we want, be involved inside politics on our side as well. Secondly, understand that we have social movements as well. So if you really want to be involved in politics, talking about issues, there's always social movements. It's not as if you can't really do anything and this is like your only choice, right? Secondly, understand that they want to argue that, these people will be more knowledgeable eventually, right? 2 reasons why this is unlikely, right? Firstly, we think that individuals are largely like busy with their work. And if you're going to talk especially about minorities, we think that minorities face this even more larger to a certain extent, because these minorities most of the time face problems like feeding their family, most of the time face problems like discrimination. Like when you want to argue on this perspective, we think it's much more harder for these individuals to put away everything and just focus on policy making in this period that they want them to spend in citizen assembly. Therefore, we think that we can at least argue and hypothesize to a certain extent that the participation of individuals wouldn't really be as great as side affirmative wants to claim. Secondly, even if they are knowledgeable, putting the best case of affirmative team, how do you ensure that they're able to reach a middle ground, right? This is when two problems largely exist, right? Firstly, side affirmative needs to understand that when it comes to controversial issues, there's always two sides, right? So for instance, when we talk about like gay rights, one side would be in support of gay rights and one side would be not in support in gay rights or possibly opposing gay rights, right? This is basically two sides of the spectrum. And to actually have a proper discourse or a fair discourse when it comes to its involving in policy making, it at least have to have a balance, right? That's really one thing that they can't really guarantee, but the only response towards this is, hey, which comes then the second problem, hey, these individuals, even if they're not in the majority inside these assemblies, they still will have their rights be heard. So you're telling me if there is an assembly with 100 individuals and there's possibly, let's be more charitable, right? We don't say there's 2 gay individuals. Let's say that's 20 individuals who support gay rights. Why would the other 70 individuals or the other 80 individuals would be incentivized to listen towards the perspectives of these individuals when most of these individuals are individuals who don't support these rights in the first place? So we think when it comes to the incentive of discourse and this idea of reaching a middle ground, it's super hard to reach this, right? They also need to understand when you want to give lectures or when you have advisors towards these individuals, how are you going to make sure these advisors aren't biased when it comes to those controversial issues, right? How are you going to ensure that these lectures or these teaching that they're going to give to these individuals structurally wrong? And if you're going to talk about biases and corruption in courts or corruptions in the Prime Minister itself, then we'll argue that most of the time these lectures or these advisors would be individuals who are biased towards the side that the government wants them to be biased to. For example, if the government doesn't really want rights for certain individuals, the government will probably push in advisors who fight for these rights, who talk about these rights, right? So we think it's very likely that corruption is going to happen to a larger scale, and likely to happen is that these individuals won't be randomly selected, but governments will just select more individuals who support their policy. And even if there's backlash from like individuals on the ground later on, they will just say, hey, this is what the assembly proposed to me, and this is just basically whatever I took from the draft of the assembly. So it's much more easier for the selected representatives, much more easier for the Prime Minister to run away from problems when they can just blame the citizens for doing that. And the worst case that they can do, or the best thing that the government can actually do, is that eventually they just say that, hey, if you're unhappy now, this is something they already did, we just randomize and rotate the citizen assembly again, proving again, randomizing again the citizen assembly, proving again that individuals who you don't really want or individuals that you don't elect are individuals who are making a policy again. So it's an endless cycle. Eventually, it'll just be randomized over and over again, and there is no reasonable reach that will be achieved on your side. So the way here is, even if affirmatives argues that all the problems would be solved, we still would argue our policies would be better. We'll still argue that a lot of these problems like corruption and discrimination would still be largely on your side and much more worse. At least on our side, we maintain democracy to a certain extent, and we allow accountability. Moving on to my second issue, which is understand that because it's random, we think that if people are unhappy, representative electives can just say that you pick this from the draft, right? And representative electives has more way of just people crafting policies, at least people, legislators who craft policies, it's much more easier to pinpoint these individuals. It's much easier to blame these individuals, especially when it comes to its legislation. So let's blame him. While it's a citizen assembly, it's so big, it's so much more harder to do that. Understand that we are the only side that understand how policy making works. We're the only side that prove to you that it will eventually work, so go with side negative.
I'd like to thank the next speaker for that speech and welcome Nick Reply to close this debate.
Hi, I just want to make sure I'm visible and audible again. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2. There are 4 minutes issues I want to quickly address my reply speech. Firstly, in terms of technical fraud coming from affirmative side, note how they did not characterize what are the metrics you actually use to select a person. All they said is we want random people from all places, all sexual orientation, all classes of group. Therefore, panel, if they randomly select a serial rapist, he is going to be your representative. If they randomly select a misogynistic person, he is going to do in your policies. There is no metric given on whether they'll be clean from criminal records or they've good track record as a citizen. As long as they are random and polarized, affirmative concedes they're okay with it. And they'll be having, they don't even tell to us, at least these people will have discussion with people before drafting policies. Nothing coming from them. All they want is random, unknown people from all groups of people. As long as they're represented, they're okay with it. Second issue then, can making these citizen assemblies finally pass policies when people take over? Affirmative claims that many of these issues are not being legislated. The question then is, panel, just because you draft 300 pages of policies within 3 weeks, will government definitely going to implement all of them? The answer is no, because you're merely giving a proposal to government and the government will have to debate in the parliament. Even if the debated parties are selected, it's going to be much more less in number. Affirmative also concedes these people are corrupt. They're against all this issue. Then, if a government is corrupt against all this issue, why are they going to debate something which is against the interest of the government? What is the exclusive harm of this method? Government can now shift the blame on 150 random people and they say they are the one who drafted counter-narrative policies and now it's being enacted because they wanted it. And note how these 150 people are being coached by government elected specialists. The comparison in our world is people can still hold politicians accountable for drafting politics against popular voice. They're able to vote them out. And politicians have an active incentive to stay in power. Therefore, they will want to make changes in policies. Instead, the random 150 people spending 3 weeks learning and drafting, they resume their life as normal people. You're not able to blame them. Second question then, who makes a better political decision? Affirmative claims there will be a conflict. People will always disagree. There are two sides. Panel, we are not defending the most perfect democracy in the world. People consciously choose and vote for parties on hope that majority of their preferred policies will be implemented, even though there are certain policies that may not resonate with. That is why to break this argument, to decide the winner, we use the scale of who satisfied the most people who voted. In affirmative, note panel, one guy from 30,000 people, a single state, is drafting legislation policies. He is unelected by anyone. If he is a gangster, so be it. He's the one going to do it. In negative, we tell to you, the majority of people within the area, even the 30,000 people and 20,000 people voted and made a politician to win. Those 20,000 people are larger in the scale of representative because we are the one who provide the politician chosen by majority people within the areas of random people. In affirmative, they claim they want to increase people's participation in democracy. Note panel, a whole country is coming out to vote a person, making their representative in state assembly and national assembly. Now it's being overturned by random 150 people who there's no metric for them to select. Therefore, the metric here in the terms of scale of participation is much more higher in our world because more people voted in the terms of whole country before choosing a politician. What is the harm to this then? Note, it makes people to lose hope in democracy. They don't want to participate in voting anymore because even if they come out and vote, queuing up for whole days, certain policies is eventually going to be overturned by random people who did not even choose to represent in the first place. Final and fourth issue then, who addresses the minority issues better? Affirmative claims that, look, minorities can actually do rally, they can show the dissatisfaction. They also tell us examples like problems Indonesia never solved. Did they prove why then will the implementation of city assembly finally solve all these problems? Because we clearly told you it eventually depends on the hands of the prime minister and state assembly to debate and solve this problem. The final nail to coffin is then now government can say 150 coach random people are the one who made this policy to ban gay people. Who then will this minority go and blame? Are they able to blame these 150 random people? No, there is no alternative resort for them when this policy, which is unpopular, is being enacted in legislative. In our world, people can still call out politicians and politicians have an incentive to change and make a better world for minorities since they want to stay in power. Never been further to oppose.
I'd like to thank Nick to reply for that speech and welcome our reply to close the debate.
Hello, can I confirm that I'm audible?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Listen, I don't want this to necessarily be a debate about statistics. Insofar, it will just be something like my statistics class all of a sudden, which is not a vibe. Negative relies on this idea that there will be a chance there will be people who don't get represented. Like example, all men deciding on like a woman woman-related controversial issue. We told you even if this somehow happens, which it won't, it's the same with governments. There's a minority problem in governments where not everyone are represented. Example, there's not much people or not as much women in politics as I'd like, or there's not a lot of poor people because there's some sort of privilege when it comes to running for office. We told you that in our speeches that you promote more empathy and discourse insofar as these people have different ideas. Even like if all these people are rich, they still may have different views. Even if we told you even if we told you that we cannot allow people in power today to be the only ones to decide things. On our side, we promote a world where you get people on the ground to be more informed and aware and empathetic to different issues. Also, I don't get negative when they say we don't illustrate our world or how it looks like. When it literally says on the info side how this looks like. It differently randomly selected people. We also talked about framing and how it looks like in both worlds. But we're just not engaging on the idea that there are polarized countries where citizens have no power, especially like example, like countries, even if it is like countries with democracy, not you can't assume that all countries have like perfect government. Don't believe negative when they say that there's suddenly accountability when that's historically not happening in countries. Democracy isn't always perfect, especially in countries that are drowning in corrupt leaders. We told you even if there are people to rally together, you can't ensure governments or officials care about these people to listen. And our second speaker already told you that this happens because like there's a little pushback and there's corruption but what it gets significantly decreased because the selection is randomly selected and there's a lot of people, so their power is shared. If they say the problem is now like because they keep saying like the problem will now shift to citizens. First, we think this is unlikely because again these policies would somehow be representative of the issues, so these people know what's happening. Even if the blame is on the citizens, it's not the same because politicians are different, because there's a blame that comes from people voting because since it's like randomly selected, there's some sort of understanding that they're not necessarily in power, and it just happens on both sides anyway. So what happens in your world is that people still get blamed, for example voting the wrong politicians or like being too annoying about the issues. It also happens in like jury duties where we allow people to like example judge literal murders when it's not an out of this world idea. And we told you that the blame doesn't work anyways on politicians, or like people try to find accountability with these politicians, especially in corrupt governments. So what we can get in our world? We told you that citizens will feel more empowered because they will feel like a higher level of social participation because they're encouraged to cooperate in these things or like invest in these issues and policies. So this is important because now you have more impact in a lot of polarized countries where the values of the government are not always reflected in, or like the citizens are always not reflected in the government. And we told you it's just better representation, like better social representation. So people are more likely to understand the issues or like participate in these things. And because of this, is more likely to get policies and people are just more informed on our side. Okay, even if you don't buy into all our benefits or don't believe it's necessary effective to get these policies or like this discourse, they never prove that people being able to participate or citizens being able to participate in these assemblies is inherently wrong or something that we just don't support. We think on our side that people get more democracy or like shared information and stuff because you encourage more information and empathies to be passed around. Don't believe them when they say that people won't just get along with this. Policies promote people to talk about, and even if you live in a world on your side where there are people who just don't allow this discourse to happen anyways. For all those reasons, it's better to live in this world where we have these citizens assemblies because it's just better for the welfare and to get people to keep moving and keep to care more. For all those reasons, side affirmative.
I'd like to thank both teams for this debate and invite both teams to cross the floor virtually to shake hands. In the meantime, we'll begin panel discussion. 3 parts is away. Firstly, general feedback, secondly, on decision, and lastly, on the issues. 4 pieces of general feedback. The first of which is I think both teams needed way more characterization as to what these citizen assemblies look like. What are the role of specialists? What are their influences? How much influence does a citizen assembly have? Are all very necessary characterizations to actually explain the impacts in which both teams want to achieve. The second is I think this debate is also very under-impacted, which is the benefits and harms often framed in very abstract terms. Like we get better discourse, we get better representation. But my question is, how does it actually affect a person in the way they interact with the political system? How does it change the way they view the world? How does it change the way they view like, keeping up with the news or following the media so they have more information when they go onto a citizen assembly, things like that. And similarly, like, what are the harms of it? Like, what are the harms of taking time out, or, for example, having really inflammatory discourse in the citizen assembly, which invalidates your experience? I think a lot of impacts were like scattered, and no one actually really explained to me why it was just so bad or why it's just so good and why it was important and why I care about it. The second thing here is that I think teams also should just do more weighing in this debate for the very reason that there were two kind of separate clashes, one on principle about democracy and one on the practical. And because of particular focuses from both teams, maybe one issue which could have been quite important has become less important in this debate, which is why I think teams should be cognizant of weighing the importance of issues, or at least trying to unlock as many win conditions as possible so that there are more reasons for me to believe why you can win a debate as opposed to less reasons. And the last thing here is just that one is a bit of a nitpick, is make sure that the whole team and the entire bench has consistency as to what an assembly does. So for example, there was a motion of clarification about, does this assembly draft policy or do they implement policy? And this debate isn't about citizens' assemblies create something and they implement it and everyone is affected about it because they've decided, and it still goes to the politicians and legislature and they implement and actually enforce that sort of policy. So I think that changes the way how some arguments operate. Some harms are less relevant than others for this reason, but be very careful and try to not to pick and choose context which is strategic for you and try to be consistent down the bench. But in terms of the decision, I thought in a unanimous decision from the entire panel, we have awarded it to side negative. So congratulations and commiserations to side affirmative. Two issues in this debate. Firstly, what is better for democracy? And secondly, do we get better policy for these controversial areas of law reform? On whether we get better democracy, affirmative claims, affirmative do not run an explicit principle, but the implicit principle is that this policy encourages better participation and you also improve representation because currently it is more diverse and selected by a lottery. And this is compared to the current status quo where representative democracy is often captured by the elite who lack things like empathy to the people, corruption, and are often motivated by self-interest. Side negative have two principal responses to this. The first one is on that it is not sufficiently representative, and the second is that it is not accountable. Starting with the weaker of the two, the idea that it is not accountable is unlikely to be persuasive in this debate for the very reason that, yes, you cannot hold citizens accountable versus you have an electoral mechanism for politicians, and I think side affirmative don't respond to this. But the problem is that the decisions made on the citizen assembly aren't binding, which means even if I come up with something which isn't the best and don't like it, there is no reason to say that the politicians were actually going to implement it, and as a result generate a bunch of harms, which is why I think this is the less persuasive out of the two responses. On to the more persuasive and more litigated part of the response, negative claim that it is not representative because even though it is random, there is no guarantee that in a discussion about Islamophobia, you will get a Muslim because of population demographics and the amount of people who are likely to be selected, essentially. Affirmative try to respond in four ways, but I think they're somewhat insufficient. The first thing to recognize is just that I think the affirmative claim here is prima facie not framed comparatively in that you explain why you might get more representation because it is a lottery, but you do not compare it to the amount of representation you're likely to get in the form of a legislature, which is to say, under the status quo, I think it is relatively intuitive to assume women still have a position in the legislature, so they can still advocate for women's issue, which means I'm unclear what the impact or marginal benefit is having a more diverse kind of demographic there. And specifically, maybe it means you get more people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, maybe you get some more different demographics, but I'm unsure why that is something which is important given the status quo or where representation exists to some extent. So I think it had to be clearer in that sense to actually make this a more impactful argument. But secondly, I think side affirmative to try to respond by explaining, well, we can tailor it to specific issues, which is to say Islamophobia is an issue, so Islamic communities form a citizens assembly. Although my problem with this response is that this is a support motion, you don't necessarily have the modeling power to target it, and also citizens assemblies implies it's a whole country, which is why this approach doesn't actually work. I think the third thing to note here is that side negative make the response, which is say 150 people isn't actually that representative, which I think is true to an extent. And the last thing which I say is, even though affirmative claim that some people can influence discussion, I think Nate identifies that you often need a critical mass, which is somewhat unlikely. And even if I believe that maybe you get a bit more diverse perspectives, I'm unclear as to why that generates a practical change or whether that in and of itself is a principal representation I outweigh quite significantly in this debate. The last kind of claim from negative in response, which is a little bit unpersuasive, is that well, 150 people can't make a decision for the rest of the country. Once again, it's explained that this is unimportant for the reason that they don't actually implement the legislation they do, that is still determined by elected legislature. But overall, I think the way you weigh this principle is that perhaps you get some more different people in this council, but the reason as to why I don't believe it is persuasive is because A, I think side affirmative never explain why they will actually have the views be sufficiently heard, and B, I think they don't actually explain why it is significantly better than status quo, which is why even if I believe your claim, it is only a small increase in representation and participation. But the problem representation. And the thing to note is that both teams actually spend most of the time discussing the practical issues about better policy, and implicitly, I think that becomes more important as material because that is what actually impacts people's lives and is what people actually care about. So that is how I saw the principle. I think it is like the contentions are there, but I think it is relatively less important compared to the second issue, which is, do we get better policy for controversial areas of law reform? I firstly identify interesting context so that this debate occurs in areas where polarization exists. There is political gridlock to prevent policy from being implemented. The few reasons as to why I think this isn't entirely persuasive is firstly, this relies upon the idea of implementing policy, which you are not doing. But secondly, I think the narrowing of the context is often untrue, given that citizens' assemblies can actually exist in like flourishing democracies, which are quite good. The info slide literally says France, which does not experience the same levels of polarization as countries like the US, which is why I think that it is a bit unstrategic to make this frame, although this does come out at first affirmative and which is reiterated at third affirmative, but I don't think it is like something which you can just narrow down and make debate entirely about, and it is more about a broader context, which is why I think it becomes a little less important. But more specifically on the actual clashes being litigated, the first of which is the idea that can people make good decisions? Affirmative say, yes, they can learn more, they're supported by experts, they encourage other these issues actually affect them, and as a result, they're likely to know how to fix it or how policies are likely to affect them, and ultimately, this is incredibly empowering. I think side negative responds in a few ways. The first is to say, well, not everyone is affected by issues that will be drafted, so they might not care, which I think is fair because not everyone is affected by the issues in the same way. The second claim, which I think is less persuasive, is that they don't focus on global issues like climate change because they care about material conditions, which I think is a bit of a generalization given people can care about more than one thing at the same time. The third thing then, I think this is the strongest response, is a bunch of structural reasons to explain why it is likely to have poor engagement, which is to say there's a lack of time, lack of knowledge, and lack of expertise. And even if side affirmative mitigate to say that it is supplemented by experts, I think side negative explain why they could be biased, they could be provided by the government, and in the absence of clearer clarification from side affirmative as to how experts are likely to affect the citizen assembly process, I struggle to find it to be persuasive. Then the second thing which also they note is that third negative identifies these things about lack of time and knowledge compound than most of the people affirmative care about, which is often minorities in these communities, which is why even if you help them, they're least likely to be able to participate in a way which actually allows them to actualize their rights. So at the end of this, I believe that even though some people might engage with it, I'm unclear why the engagement is actually going to be positive and the engagement is actually going to deliver good outcomes, which is why I think it's insufficient just to say people might care a little bit more now. The second thing then we said is this idea about what happens in discourse. Affirmative made it even if claims that it doesn't matter if they don't get policy, insofar as they're being heard, it is a good thing. And that is good because there are more diverse opinions and different perspectives. I think next response here are strong in that they accept that yes, there is discourse, but they accept that especially in the context side affirmative discusses about polarizations, debates are likely to be controversial and they're likely to be inflammatory, which means that even if you say something about, about an issue you care about, if the rest of your council is like homophobes, you obviously feel quite awful about it. It means that discourse is not in of itself a benefit and can actually have quite a deleterious impact on the individual, which is why I think that once again means that is probably more of a harm which gets flipped as opposed to a benefit which side affirmative claims. But I think the critical thing as to why all of what I've said before amounts to a side negative win is even if I believe side affirmative in this absolute best case scenario where it's just like you get good policy and you can get people are engaged and you get good policy, I think they never do the mechanistic link to explain why this policy is going to be adopted by the legislature who is going to be implemented. I don't think this is a hard thing to do in that you can explain why the citizen assembly has a lot of authority. It has like a lot of kind of it's supposed to represent popular will, but in absence of that analysis, I think it is very hard to claim the actual impacts, which means that the thing I had to adjudicate this debate on was this idea about what happens to discourse, and the discourse, I believe, from side negative is likely to be worse than better on net for the reason it is inflammatory, it is often polarized, and often the voices which appear in these councils are likely to be quite minimal and quite few, and is likely to incur a tyranny of the majority effect, and that I think is quite harmful. I mean, these assemblies do not actually achieve what they set out to do. I hope this makes sense, but thank you so much for this debate. I guess does anyone have any immediate questions?